Alright everybody, welcome back to another video on the elite theorists. So today we're going to be going over Bertrand de Jouvenel's On Power. A lot of you are probably already familiar with this book. It's a pretty well-known book in our sphere of the internet, and well, I had to say it's a very good book. If you're going to get into elite theory, I think you have to read this book. Um, Now we're going to go over the whole book. There's a lot of information in this book, so naturally some stuff is going to be left out, so I encourage you to go read it yourself. Also, sorry if my voice sounds a little weird. It's kind of late while I'm recording this, but yeah. So we're going to go over generally the most important aspects, or what I think to be the most important aspects in this book. So with that said, just keep in mind some details are going to be left out. Uh, I suggest you go read this yourself, and also watch this video and watch other videos on it. Um, the book is quite long also, so this video might be a little long, so I ask for your patience. But I'm going to try and keep it short and try and keep it concise. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So he starts out by stating that warfare becomes larger and more centralized as states centralize, and power becomes larger and more homogeneous as well. As a byproduct, when one state has a method of warfare, other states will adopt these methods of warfare similar in order to compete with these other states. This wasn't the case in the Middle Ages, when warfare was on a much smaller scale and typically relegated to a certain set of individuals in a class. Now, warfare, because of the expansion of the state, utilizes the common man as a kind of cannon fodder in order to reach its advancements, and we're going to touch on that again later in this book. Within every society, there lies a center of control, and people often have questions about it or are skeptical of it. All societies have governments, and these governments manifest itself in different forms. However, the Juvenal is concerned with the essence behind all the accidental properties of governments. And by accidental, I mean contingent here. Or in other words, he's concerned with what all governments have in common despite their accidental or contingent expressions. And what they all have in common is power. And he wishes to create a metaphysic of power, or I should say, analyze a metaphysic of power. Power requires obedience, and the amount of obedience power receives, the more or less we can measure the strength of that power. So, obedience is that which limits power, and these limits can change by degrees throughout history and can be affected by other factors as well. The Juveniles asks, what is the basis on which power is maintained? Many say that the reason the citizens obey the tax collector is because the person higher than them can order force against them. However, the question is pushed further. How does the minority in power develop an army that is loyal to begin with, to enforce these laws? The reason is that it has become a habit of human beings, and it is something we accept as a fact of nature. Often, our first experience with power is to obey our fathers, for instance, or those in our lives with authority over us. Often, we are told that societies which were monarchic used force to maintain power. However, these societies were ruled by a small group of people with small armies, which doesn't seem to fit that theory. So today, we're told we live in a democracy which self-governs through consent. However, our armies and police are much more powerful than we've ever seen before. Analysis of power is something to be done by historians, as we can retroactively look into the past and from there develop a thesis of how power operates based on what we find common in states. We can also say that the analysis of different states in one nation or one person can really be analyzed as just one state changing over time, as states, or rather anything that does not exist, or anything, yeah, that does not exist in this world, that it is not a result of a process. So let me rephrase it because that was phrased poorly. Anything that exists in this world is a result of a process. So when we view things that exist in the here and now, the best way to view them is as a result of a slow evolution, according to Juvenal, and this can be applied to states. So the second cause of obedience is basically reasoning or some kind of external justification that power over others is something necessary. The third cause is a notion of a quote-unquote common good, that power justifies itself by saying that it is present to protect all people, and people naturally want to be protected, so they accept this. Force can create power, and obedience maintains it. However, in order for it to spread, it must have credit or credence, which is to say, Having a good reputation creates respect for power, and when something is respected, it often is allowed to do as it pleases. Power believes it has the right to sovereignty, and that this belongs to it in itself, and is often used as its justification for its dominion over others. Different kinds of notions of sovereignty create different kinds of government. Divine sovereignty created monarchies, and popular sovereignty created parliamentary democracies. On divine sovereignty, often it is said in the Middle Ages that divine sovereignty was the basis for rulership, and that this rulership was unlimited because of it. However, this is false, and often created in order to justify some notion that we have obtained liberty today. It was the case that multiple power structures existed, and they would limit one another, such as the church and the state, and the smaller patricians over certain portions of land. There are also distinguishing characteristics of power: sovereignty, legislative authority, and its ability to alter its subjects at will, and also to be above or act above the laws it imposes. Now, the notion that God gave them power to use as they please and that they held some divine right has also been grossly mistaken. In reality, they were said to have been given power by God, but they did not own this power. God did. And they only held this position as a trust, so to speak. It was almost like they were renting their position of power. And they must use it in the direction of God's will and not their own. On popular sovereignty, early forms of this had stated that God puts the power in the people to rule themselves. So this is like the proto-popular sovereignty, and not some beneficial man to do it. Thus, we see things like the social contract form, etc. Eventually, things like the social contract become justified when they remove God as a necessary component for sovereignty. Rather, it now lies in the people alone. And that's where we get that modern idea of the social contract. Then we see with Hobbes and Spinoza a notion of sovereignty that is despotic, according to Juvenel. Hobbes says that any leader elected by the people cannot be critiqued, as they, the people, put him there, and it is their fault. Spinoza also says that whoever holds power belongs to him absolutely, and all must obey him, even if it's a ridiculous decree. So, yeah, it's kind of absurd, the Spinoza's and Hobbes's notion of power here, or ethics of power, I should say. Checks on power evolved from the Middle Ages, where we had a check on the monarch by the church, and now we have a check of the leader by things like the parliament, which are much closer to the masses. There are two fundamental principles behind power. They are God or the people. Either of these tend to be invoked as the highest principle or source of power, and there are also those which limit power or subordinate the sovereign who wields power. However, since they are above those who wield power, they are also above those who are under those in power, i.e., the lower classes or subjects. The different power structures within society often try and interlink so that way they can have unlimited power. So they try to, basically become one unit, so that way their power is easier to, I guess, enforce. This is understood, so precautionary measures are taken, and this usually involves dividing power into smaller bodies, but this then leads to a disorder, and then power takes over again with a more despotic person in charge. The ruler, under a popular will or democratic will, is more likely to be more degenerate, as he can change the laws as he pleases, and rules of morality are subject to change and become conflated with his own will, as opposed to God's. If he is met with confrontation, he can always fall back that the people wanted him in power, so he is right in what he is doing, as the people wanted him. Now, in my video on Robert Michel's, he also talks about something similar with Napoleon. If the ruler is tied to a god, the laws are eternal, and he must abide by them and enact them. The early conceptions of power and people were seen as nominal. For instance, in Rome, they saw Romans as a collection of people in a certain area, and they didn't see themselves separate from the state. Just different people of Rome with different interests. We can see this in how they speak of themselves. The Romans said they are the people, the quote-unquote the people of Rome, or the quote-unquote the Senate and the people of Rome. So Rome is a husk which people inhabit, not the people themselves who are just individuals. The masses becoming the source of power and sovereignty become intensified with the introduction of Hegelian thought, which views the nation as one large organism that acts as a whole, and the individuals of this nation are like these cells in a body and are reflective of this whole. This leads to the absolutism on the basis of the popular will from below rather than from God above. Furthermore, one can easily say that much like cells, they start out as simple, and as they grow and expand become more complex. The same can be said for society. The cells can be replaced, and they all engage in a division of labor that is also unified at the same time. We can see the cells create quote unquote societies, which and these cells are analogies for human beings, and as effects are related to their causes. So we thus see societies are created by humans who are cells composed of smaller cells. So one theory of the origin of power is the family structure. Fathers lead the family, and society is made up of families. When they are considered as an aggregate, make up one society. So yeah, so you have tiny societies that make up larger societies. This goes right back into that notion of the cell, or the human beings being the cells of society, and human beings are also composed of cells. So that also ties into it, and families are the next cell, I guess you could say. Anyway, we either have one man or a small group of men who excel in the domain of competence and produce a feeling of security, and they take the wheel of society. So that's how you get leaders. Usually these start out as aristocracies. Often, if you had a more decentralized form of government, you'd have the meeting of several tribes, which were formerly one family that divided into different ones, and the largest had the most dominion over others. The heads of the tribes would also meet as well. Thus, the most natural form of government has either been monarchy or a senate. However, we did have examples of families where the mother took the lead. She took the lead role, such as the Native American tribes, the Iroquois in particular. The children in maternal led families would take the mother's last name, and their social value was derivative of those of the mother rather than the father. So the paternal aspect is a decent explanation, but it's not a full explanation in the origins of power, because it's not necessary. Also, children of the tribe did not belong to their father or even their mothers. Rather, they belonged to the whole tribe. It wasn't until later that the men would capture women and then impregnate them that the children would be seen as their property, there as in being the man's property. So now we have, according to de Jouvenel, a new conception of power and now he's going to talk about one of magical origins. This is interesting. So tribes have always had mystical beliefs, and being a tribe, nothing was more important than its safety, and this relied on the gods keeping the tribe safe. And if one was banished from this tribe, it was seen as one of the scariest things that could happen, as you are being expelled from a place of order to one of chaos, where no protection lies. If anything bad happened to the tribe, it was seen as a direct evil occurring to it, whether this be from another tribe or just natural causes. It was still seen as an evil from some deity. Thus, the elders of the tribe, having more wisdom of such things, were to be trusted, and their opinion held in high regard, so they ended up leading the tribe. Now, the tribal elders also had roles in the participation of rites, such as certain sacrifices, so they were held to a very high regard, and if they messed this up, they, in some occasions, were actually put to death, because it was seen as anything bad happening being their fault. Uh, However, we can't say that they fit into the categories of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, as they didn't practice the civil methods we do now. Rather, if they needed to make an important group decision, they would invoke the will of God to decide. They also believed this to be so important that it held society together, and if not maintained, it would actually damage society. If people didn't follow these rites, they were looked down on, and so now we see the introduction of the usage of the supernatural and the superstitious as a pragmatic tool to discipline people in the tribes and eventually larger society. Magical power is conservative in nature, as it is concerned with authority and checking to make sure things remain stable and secure. De Jouvenel says that he favors the notion that it is patriarchal societies that develop states first, and this makes sense, the most sense because of the natural inclination of men over women. Men also exert power through war, and thus war helps sustain and create power. There's a natural tendency to have a warlike spirit in many men, one principle of men, but also people, of men and people, is to expand and get as much for themselves as they can, and this disposition is the instinct of war and conquest. War is usually done by the youth to help profit themselves and also the rest of society, because the youth are more fit to fight than the elderly. The old profit through monopoly and instilling disciplinary values and security over resources on their subjects. The patriarchal family and society comes about from the male conquering of women and using them to reproduce their numbers and build a stronger military. The men, in order to do this, must manage women within a society. So war makes one rich, but it being rich also makes one have to increase their labor force. So if a tribe captures a lot of cattle, they need to monitor and protect this new wealth. Usually women watch over them or lower members watch over them. And as society becomes more advanced, usually slaves. And of course, the best warrior gets the spoils, but also has the most responsibility to keep track of the spoils that he obtained. When war takes away the life of members in the tribe, they are usually replaced by slaves or prisoners. And promiscuity, or they have lots of promiscuous sex, is a common behavior to try and grow numbers. However, many men are weak, and the strongest get the women. So we see the lower classes develop, which create the first plebeians. These weaker men still need protection from the stronger, so they become subordinate to them basically. These warriors, basically, because they are more successful, are the first rulers, and below them are those who require their protection. So, being good at war and conquering is the genesis of power, and the individuals in a tribe who did so were the first leaders. The king is often restricted in what he can do, while at the same time having dominion. He must follow a certain amount of social laws and legal customs, while at the same time he can enjoy the luxury of organizing society. The kings also require the chiefs to enact his will on the lower classes, so he is powerless without them. A victory for the king will be a victory for the rest of society, however, as he tends to be more relaxed, feeling confident in himself. He allows others to enjoy more freedom below, and maybe even have a little power themselves. Now, if the king gets a loss, he becomes more insecure. He needs to make sure it is clear that it is he who is in charge, so things become more authoritarian and more strict. Kingship becomes a monarchy when the king seeks to unify more of the different groups he has conquered. Typically, this would happen when they would synthesize the various cults of peoples. They would often use religion as a tool to keep the groups together. Kings become monarchs through bringing together confederations and conquering more groups and uniting them. The monarch period was truly the period in which power was centralized and fit nearly into its own domain separate from others. So there's a view that power relies on the nation, which is somewhat true, but also the state of a nation or the government is the manifestation of the nation in a personified manner. This can often be true, especially in a populist sense. However, we also see the state can be used to exploit the people and be hijacked, so it's not entirely accurate. So, the state doesn't always represent the people. Um, Excuse me, sorry, I got lost here. Okay. The Juvenal offers us a definition of power in its pure sense, which is that the essence of power is to command and be obeyed. These are the only necessary attributes according to him. The essence of power, once again, is command, and the Juvenal is from here going to use the essence as a universal present in all forms of power to demonstrate that it is the case that the essence of power is command. This is like a metaphysical political analysis, essentially, is what he's doing here. People take issue with the essence of power being defined as command because they see it as an effect. However, this is refuted as the Juvenal says that it is easier to see that a minority of men have the ability to command than a majority of men having the will to obey. The fact that this is seen historically shows that a minority can command easily. Um, so one can't say the origin of power is nations, as the origin of nations must come from power. However, one could say that nations do enlarge power once established. That is something you could say. Now, actually, I think I should. This is a little bit ambiguous here. The previous thing that I just mentioned about, command not being in effect, and the Juvenal says something once again that it's easier to see that a minority of men have the ability to command than a majority of men having the will to obey. Now, I think what he's trying to say here is that in all societies, it is the case that it's always a minority in power. There are more people who are not in power than there are people who are in power. So I think that's the point he's trying to make there. So if it's not command, then we see that there's a lack of, it's not, it's the only valid explanation would be command. And now there are reasons why that command is justified, as we kind of touched on before. But yeah, that would be the essence of power, would be command. So, small nations or territories can be accurately said to be created via the human instinct to socialize. However, once this process gets larger, it is done through fusion from a high source of power to unite them, like we saw with the ancient kings. The large nations are always created through conquest and unification. We can see this especially in the creation of America and Australia, as well as the Roman Empire. These states can't exploit too much because then they'll collapse under their egoism and take in more than they can manage. The reason the king can have so much power over his subjects is because he has created the apparatus of the state and can exploit the subjects through it. He has created this apparatus by having dominion over resources, etc. Over time, the self-serving function of power by extension but not intention tends to care for the good of a society because often the general good of a society is good for those in power, as stability is always needed to even have a society. And both king and pleb want a society that is safe. The king is an outgrowth of the conquerors who manage the lower classes, and conquer. The king manages to conquer the conquerors in a sense, eventually replacing them with another group. So the power difference between king and pleb is of degree, but there's a middle one as well. So this goes into the high-low versus middle that everyone talks about. The king does not over time become more affectionate as is the king does over time become more affectionate as it's his human nature to do so. Just to think of a human not wanting to kill a small animal because he feels bad and knows that he has more power over it. So there is still some kind of aspect of real sympathy that comes from people in power. It's not always negative. So power becomes less parasitic and more symbiotic, as also the higher classes require the lower classes' obedience, and then he eventually becomes more affectionate to them. People start to see the monarch as the embodiment of the state, and that their allegiance to the monarch is the same as the allegiance to the state. In Rome, they did something similar with the veneration of the emperor. In order for power to last long, it needs to, in some degree, appeal to the people and their needs. As if they get fed up, society becomes unstable, and the elite will be replaced with the new elite. So it's only in the interest elite to kind of, become more sympathetic. Revolutionary states tend to start out as idealistic and wish to serve the people. However, over time, power becomes self-serving and it loses touch with its base. That once again, that touches back on what Robert Michels was also saying. When the sovereign has power, whomever it may be, they start to feel a superiority over their subjects. And they don't want to appeal to their desires, even if they share the same desires, because appealing to them looks weak. So in order to circumvent this, he adopts the opposite values of their values to show his will is superior through being opposed to theirs. I guess you could say that's a sign of decadence, of elite decadence. Society has at least two domains socially. One is the subjects and one is power. Within power, there's basically another society which has its own interests, which is chiefly to maintain itself as being in power. We often think that there is one society in place, but there are always two societies. One, the masses, which we regard as a general society, and one of the ruling class, which we don't often see as a society, even though it is. He also talks about how power changes an individual, and he sounds very similar once again to Robert Michels when he talks about how often these people are part of certain political movements. Once they obtain power, they go through a psychological transformation and they become detached from their roots and lose sight of the good of the people. They become something else. So egoism in power is a perennial phenomenon, as well as the forms they take are different, but nonetheless, as a principle, they remain the same. We see in primitive tribes egoism being things like eating large meals, or something like this. And in the contemporary society, taking large amount of taxes or finding ways to use your power to obtain more money. So basically, the egoism as society becomes more advanced and more abstract, is the point he's trying to make. Power is either egotistical or altruistic. Power can grow very fast if it combines these two things in the sense that it presents itself as on the side of the people while being egotistical and cold and calculated. It can grow because people do not see it as a threat and actually see it as the opposite of a threat. Power, like all things that want to survive, must love itself, and thus it becomes egotistical, and it sustains itself by cloaking its selfishness in altruism. However, it knows not to be too altruistic, as that'll end up leading to its death, and vice versa. It can't be too egotistical because it will generate instability and thus also lead to its death. Rulers often see those whom they rule as an extension of their ego, as almost their property, which they can manage, and it belongs to them, and anything that goes wrong is a failure on the part of their own ego. A stable hold on power creates a maximum identification of the ego with the subjects, and a transient less so, and one more concerned with chance occurrences, as the full identification of the ego with the masses is not present, as the dominion over them is not stable. So I'll repeat that once again. A stable hold on power creates a maximum identification of the ego with the subjects, and a transient one less so. So basically, power is seen as once it becomes identified with the masses, it becomes more, I guess you could say, I don't know, stable. It becomes more entrenched with them, I guess is the point he's trying to make. In other words, those who are in power care less about society because they just know that their control is limited. They won't have to deal with the consequences long term, whereas one who's in power for their lifetime will have to do so. So he has an incentive to care as it'll affect him. It is the same reason you care more about what you own than what you don't own, as it's closer to you as a person. So yeah, that's the point. You know, the more dominion, the longer your dominion lasts, the less transient it is. Which is to say, the less, if you're in power for a long period of time, you're going to care about what it is you're ruling over because it's going to affect you. If your power is transient, if it's moving, you're going to be less entrenched. Your power is going to be less solidified within that society. So you're going to care less about it. So I hope that clears that up. Sometimes egoism can accidentally do good for a society, like a trickle-down effect, so to speak, and other times it can do untold harm. Power uses the social security of subjects as a justification for its growth. In times of war or social distress, power will expand and from there, it will have more of the population on its side, as it is promoting security in the public interest. After the events have passed, however, the power tends to maintain the new dominion it has achieved instead of reducing it back to what it was. So, actually, you see a lot of people talk about this today with the pandemic stuff. War is not the only excuse that power uses in protecting the public. They will also say that they protect the public from other forms of power which are different in nature and that are considered to be a threat. The Juvenile also points out how other power structures exist, but just because they're not government doesn't mean they are any less egotistic, because after all, they're run by humans. He also speaks on how thought can lead to the utopian ideas which in the past are too premature to be realized, but in the present come ever closer to being so. Lots of the ideas of Plato's Republic, for instance, are an example, such as the communal living, etc. We now see or saw this with the commie blocks, for instance, or in more contemporary times with the slow creation of megacities. The philosopher often gets lost in his fantasies of an ideal society, as well as these ideas become so unrealistic at times that people start adopting ones that don't work, and they become dissatisfied when they're not instantiated. But nonetheless, the point being made is that the promulgation of philosophical thought regarding power influences power, and once these sentiments permeate society, power can use that to reinforce itself. Moving on here, he talks about political rivalries, and that society is an aggregate of different authorities, bending the will of their subjects in order that they can grow and fight each other. Rivalries exist because the nature of power is to expand, and like knows like, which in this context is to say that authority attracts more authoritarianism. So yeah, basically, rivalries stimulate the growth of power, I guess is what he's saying. We see that power becomes more centralized and that geopolitical disputes become greater as nations take new territory. One could see this with the antagonism between the French, English, and Spanish in early America, for instance. These nations will start to industrialize and develop overall, and this may seem peaceful on its face, but in reality, this is being done to prepare for potential warfare with competing structures. When a nation starts to exploit its own resources, this is typically a sign that they are preparing for war or conquest, or to become a power that is harder to compete with, as they are willing to take such a risk to their domestic interests in order to strengthen themselves. When a nation becomes more centralized and militaristic, the surrounding nations, if they want to survive, must do so as well, or else they have the threat of being crushed by a stronger competing power. Adaptation is key, essentially, and you can watch my video on political metastability, which talks a lot about that as well. War itself can be started as an excuse to increase power over the subjects in a nation and without. A modern example of this would be the war on terror, increasing surveillance on people domestically, and the American government occupying nations in the Middle East in an almost colonial sense. The aristocratic regime imposed the narrowest limits on a nation's involvement in war, as it is allergic to the expansion of power, and I think here he means other powers. Uh, you know, the and later in the book, I did realize that is what he meant, because the aristocracy wants to prevent the encroachment of the monarchy or the power above it. He also distinguished between two types of aristocratic regimes. The first being land, which is a formation of power that is less stable and disinclined. And the second being urban, which is more organized and disciplined, it's more centralized. Power always tries to find any barriers surrounding it. So we see in Europe, one of the primary examples of this is when taxation went from consensual and a representative thing to an arbitrary one, which is a sign that power is expanding. Kings often want to have universal military service, as this provides an army for them to protect against internal threats and external and internal threats. Could be other powerful elites as well within the domain of the king. Before this, military service was reserved for a noble class, but the kings wanted more manpower, so they expanded their, um, their requirements for military service. We see that in modern power structures with now the ability to have all of the men of a country drafted into war. The men of a country are viewed as cannon fodder. The ruling class here can do this because they have access to all the national income, whereas in a monarchy, the king had access to a proportion of the national income, so to speak, but the church owned the rest, or the majority of it. And as a principle, throughout this book, it's been seen that power is always trying to expand. I want to make sure that's understood here. And this has been, and it has always been increasing and has been going unnoticed. And he wants to find out why it's been the case that it's gone unnoticed. The conclusion he comes to is that this is occurring that before the expansion of power, there were multiple powers divided up, and often they required obedience and certain obligations. And once these powers were taken out of the subject, or taken out of the subject's everyday existence, he lost his obedience to them, and now he feels as if he was free from power, when in reality it was just one that took over the other power structures which he was obedient to. So it's an illusion that he's becoming less subject to power, when in reality power took over these other powers and it is expanding. These authorities were the social authorities, to be specific, by the way. For example, church, and they required more of a participation of the subjects or the citizens. And once they get wiped out, the citizen feels more free. So, also these power structures that got wiped out were structures that demanded more of the citizen uh, in an everyday sense. So that's also why it goes unnoticed. But generally speaking, it goes unnoticed because the other powers take out the powers that the subject was required to be obedient to or subordinate to. Now, one reason that power wants to get rid of other forms of power, and in this case the political getting rid of the social, is that power wants access to human obligations and social dues that the other powers have right now. So that's why things like the church and other social authorities would be negated, because they require too much human participation that the higher powers could use. That's essentially the motivation, rather. People are split up into groups, and there are various authorities to govern all of these groups, and not all of these have absolute power. However, they have some power, and this power wants to expand, so the authorities have often gotten into a conflict with power. Here we're going to start seeing this de Jouvenel's model. Those who are ruled by the authorities don't really have to fear anything if the state advances, because they'll just replace their power with theirs. In other words, they have nothing to lose because they're always going to be ruled over regardless. Power, when it seeks resources, will start to expand and remove the lower authorities. Typically, the authorities are using them for wealth and power, us using them for manpower to help it expand ever more. In order for power to sublate or negate the authorities, they will need to appeal to the masses, which the authorities rule over. Power gets on the side of the masses and thus uses their sentiment to destroy the social authorities, and thus expand its power without the barrier of these authorities. Many refer to this as the high-low versus middle, or in other words, the highest power united the lower classes to negate the barrier for the highest power, and that barrier is the middle power. So the aristocracy would be the middle power in most cases. This view of power is not too well known, and is contrasted with that of thinkers such as Marx, who think that power acts as a monolith and that there are no distinctions between power conglomerates. So the question becomes, what does power do with these social authorities that is taken out? Well, typically it will take these authorities and then integrate them into their own power and make them serve them, and thus their bureaucracy will expand. The accidents of the state, or the contingent properties of the state, are always changing. This makes the state take the role of an ontology of permanent becoming, which sounds paradoxical, I know, but whereas power as a principle remains the same, thus following the principle of being. So that's a metaphysical way of understanding that. Following on from the principle of being and becoming would be the fact that in the becoming, or the changing aspects of the state, it is always appearing as if it is protecting the lower class, when in reality it is using them to negate the middle class and empowers a principle of being, or what stays the same, it is always protecting the privileged or itself. So it is always manipulating the lower class in some sense, but what always stays the same, or what always has the most value, is the privileged or higher classes. The middle class understands this and tries to prevent this by asserting themselves in seats of government to try and prevent the tide of power taking them out. So they try and secure a spot for themselves that's in the power that's expanding. When societies which have a center of political power aren't formed by an individual rising from the masses to take over, rather, uh, I'm sorry, great societies which have a center of political power aren't formed by an individual rising from the masses to take them over. Rather, they are formed by clans which unite either because they want to or they're forced to do so. The kings have to try and bring these clans together. Now remember, the kings arise from these clans to begin with as a growth and expansion away from them. And they need to break the unity they have so they can have dominion over them, because the more something is unified, the more powerful it is. One way power asserts dominance over the middle powers is materially. He demands grants and aid. More frequently, he starts to demand a sum of wealth generated from the workers of the middle powers. So he starts to kind of abuse these middle powers in order to kind of make them subject to him. He starts, taxing the shit out of them. Basically, is one way of putting it. The middle class is often one of wealth and access to many resources, but they don't seek so much political power, more so just wealth and exploitation, and thus power uses their access to resources and converts it to strength. Once the state spreads and obtains a massive amount of power, it becomes the epicenter of all privileges, and all positions of privilege stem from it. However, the barons now working for the state, in which power has subsumed, will try to use their position for personal gain and pass down their role to their kids. The state sees this and then expands its power again. All the positions of power, middle or high, are competing for the labor force, and in times of war the state will use the labor force, but when it's over they will throw them back to the barons, who will exploit them in their own way. Power's tendency and desire to grow, uh, and it can only do this by taking in the masses and utilizing them. And of course the middle powers try to do this too. However, the middle powers are more equipped to fight them and don't depend on the higher so much, and thus the higher uses the lower and becomes its quote-unquote ally, not really an ally, in a paradoxical sense for its equality. So it can increase its power and be favored by the general population. So the highest classes tend to appeal to equality because they want to get the lower classes on their side and basically get in their boat and have them basically like them. So they it's kind of a weird paradox. They're going to appeal to interests contrary to their own in order to gain the interests of the lower class, when in reality they're only appealing to these interests that are contrary to their own, i.e. equality, in order to um, progress their own interests, which is an interesting method of doing so. The growth of power, that is, state power, had its origins in the aggregate of clans which we spoke of earlier, but the way of which this was done was when power would slowly substitute institutions granted by the social authorities or middle powers with their own and thus become independent. A perfect example of this would be the courts, where the barons or middle powers were subsumed, and they'd also express their differences, and also the king would pack these courts with people who agreed with him, and this way he'd be able to wipe out opposition even further and thus expand his power once again. The state uses the people of the nation as a tool to buttress its power, and they use this mass of people to fight against the aristocrats. The nobility or middle power sets a limit on high power the regality, and in theory the high power can eliminate the middle power, and it has. However, it usually stops itself from doing so because it wants to adhere to traditions and common sentiment. Another sign of the fact that power wishes to use the resources is the fact that we can see things such as the Royal Navy or Air Force exist, but the Army lacks this, as the Army is essentially the manifestation of the ruling class using the masses as a warfare tool and essentially cannon fodder. So that way, the ruling class, can utilize it in power expansion easier. So basically, he's saying that wishes to use its resources quicker once it centralizes, is that you start to see the negation of these royal military operations, these royal military regiments, I guess you could say. So Juvenal critiques the French aristocrats for trying to get rid of the king, for having too much power because they needed to install a worse tyrant and a more controlling one. Their action or praxis was to replace all the political opponents with their own in Parliament as well, which helped reinforce this. Beliefs can affect and limit power as well, because power will be limited in what it can derail, especially if the beliefs are more deeply rooted within society. Many often say that superstition or religious belief are that which reinforces power, and now Juvenal wants to analyze this and see if it's an accurate idea. The rationalist purports that primitive man was a free individual until the natural cancer of power came to be, and then man became enslaved. Think of, I believe it was Rousseau who said a man is born free, but everywhere he's put in chains, something along those lines. However, when we look back into primitive society, we see that men were not free, but were held to social norms which made everyday action follow a strict set of rules. Speaking of rules, Juvenal also points out that in young societies, rules are imposed upon people, but the rules are seen as applying to all peoples, and it isn't until society's age that leaders may be able to be more free with their power. Typically, these come in the forms of religious belief. Suggestion also plays a role, or the feeling of social pressure prevents those in power, and even those not in power, from acting out. Those familiar with Lacan will understand this concept to be the big other. Those with deep religious beliefs will also become more willing to remove those from society who they see as transgressors because they think that their tolerance of sin will harm them or the society as a whole. There is a large distinction between powers that take the good and describe themselves as the source of it, and powers that say the good comes from God, as the former is more absolute and as it considers itself the arbiter of morality uh, and its generator. So, in other words, societies that say law comes from God are going to be more stable and less authoritarian because power is seen as something outside the state, which the state is subject to. And therefore it's more absolute and less transient and more stable. The reason religious movements like Islam have been able to spread was because they were able to use God as a tool. So in some case, yes, God does work as a tool for power expansion, but it can just as easily not work. Divine law tends to disappear when it is relegated to general forms of governance, and we start to see a plethora of laws come into being which are contingent and minuscule. However, so many of the contingent laws come in that they end up eclipsing the divine laws. So in other words, you have, as a state, you have to deal with everyday problems, right? And you're going to have to change the nature of your laws to deal with that. You're not always going to, there are going to be things that the divine law are not going to be able to account for. So the laws are going to become more specific to certain particular instances within a society, and that's going to eventually grow, and the divine laws are going to kind of be secondary or kind of, in other words, eclipsed or put out of place. And then now we're going to start to see the justification of getting rid of the divine laws here in a minute. This, in ancient times, was often a product of the state having to intervene between disputes between citizens and act on the issue and on the here and now. Now, if an individual offended the state, they offended God or the gods. So once again, they could appeal to religion. However, in the case of the minute or small individual disputes, the appeal to the state as a plain power apparatus started to increase as more disputes occur. Less of an appeal to the transcendent does, because the transcendent was only concerned with the state itself and not the everyday disputes and issues among citizens. I hope that makes more sense. The more thought out the conception of God in society, the more of an appeal to the divine law there will be, as the society can create a coherent account of morality. The Juvenal also talks about how the laws are considered eternal, which is why it becomes difficult for society to appeal to them when they have to deal with moral situations which change and are in flux, as they can't always consistently appeal to principles, and thus comes the start of the degradation of the notion of the divine. That's what I just touched on before. Law and custom are very similar, as they both exist as a product. Custom especially takes on a religious nature, as people feel the need to obey custom, and there doesn't seem to be any alternative mode of acting. It's incomprehensible in some cases. Even these laws and customs can be a buttress against power, as even those in power feel a sense of obligation to these things unconsciously, as they too are only human. This is less so the case because people just don't believe anymore, but it was the case. Even for power to work, those in power often have to appeal to the customs and laws to have the masses on their side, and once again, it is not always that hard since they often share it themselves. It takes time for society to mature to when they can start imposing their own ideas on the populace. So power develops by little increments, we see, which start out as reinforcing custom and then creating more laws to reinstate custom and then finally new laws entirely to do so. Eventually, these little increments, once they surpass custom, can be considered to be also surpassing religious tradition, as that's part of it as well. Once society becomes more rationalist, rather, this starts to occur and the beliefs of power or where power comes from start to degrade slowly and move from God to man. The realization of this turn toward man, or I should say, turn away from God toward man, makes one see that morality is not really grounded in anything proper. So disputes are not solved through an appeal to objective morals, but now through warfare. Revolutions, when a state begins, revolutions occur rather when a state begins to become weak and unstable, not just when injustice is felt, and when the state is removed, it is always replaced by stronger power to fill in the lack of stability. Now, this is interesting because often we are told that revolutions occur when the state becomes too overbearing or too authoritarian. But actually, it's the opposite. Revolutions occur when the state becomes too unstable. So, when kings are removed or die out, it is the case not because they are too tyrannical, like I just said, but because they are too weak to manage their own population. Revolutions never stunt the growth of power, as we mentioned, they only help it develop more and take a new, stronger form. It takes a new, stronger form because the state was weak and needed to adapt to reintroduce stability to manage itself from within and protect itself from without. So, lots of these revolutions seek to find liberty and liberate the people, when in reality, they just expand power and dominion over human behavior. The greatest example of this is the Russian Revolution, because ideologically, being Marxist, it was not opposed to capitalist power, but power in principle, and only seeking to establish a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat in order to eventually rid society of class distinction. The state changes and power remains the same once we strip all the individual expressions of power. However, these individual expressions do matter, and they tell us something about the nature of the previous state. A state that holds liberty to its fundamental view or something of this sort shows to us that the last state failed to adapt to these human sentiments, and that is why it is gone. It's almost you can almost look at the states as animals. They have these certain attributes because their ancestors lacked them, and that's why they died out. Ideas are said to be that which form the shape of the state, and it is true, but these ideas stem from human passion and sentiment rather than from, for instance, in the Hegelian view, human cunning of reason or spirit, and not in the Marxist view either, where the ideas are a product of material conditions. These ideas that win are not a product of rational deduction from either of these things per se. They may start out from both these things, and often do, but every time they become more so just human passions that triumph, as they have more potency to move the individual. So yeah, people are more motivated by human passions rather than uh, logic and abstract reasoning. As the monarch loses power, once again, contrary to popular belief, the state's power actually expands. Parliament becomes the new king, essentially, as it is now that which makes the laws, and from there, because a parliament in a democracy is something which is in flux, it can pass almost any law it wants, as all previous institutions which put limits on power have lost the ability to do so. The church is no longer seen as having real authority, as once again the divine or God is not that which is appealed to, but rather the people or the masses are that which are appealed to. So morality becomes arbitrary. Also, in these assemblies, you have the representation of many groups, and thus factions start to occur as well. And then we see power starting to fight one another, and each one trying to expand its dominion over the rest, which can lead to another form of absolutism. The body which makes laws has also become the body which reinforces them, and then this then makes power omnicompetent, which is to say that not only is it good at creating laws, but is also good at making sure they're actualized. Whereas in the past, a king would enforce laws, but these laws came from without him, or from outside of him, I should say, or the principle that these laws were founded on at the very least, which were God. The king's laws were relying upon a sovereign being or entity outside it. When the democratic government is autonomous, um, it basically negates this, and it says the laws are a product of itself. So the problem with the man-oriented government systems is that they proclaim to be inducing liberty when in reality, because these laws are always changing, we are not really liberated, but rather enslaved to the arbitrary wills of men. In the end, this form of governance contradicts itself, as we are always enslaved to different factions and interests. People crave an imperium, and when there have been two types of the, and there have been two types, the younger and older imperiums. The younger ones are weaker and less established, and the local authorities are trying to increase their own power and set themselves into developing this imperium, whereas in the older ones, the imperium has already amassed a vast amount of wealth and power, so the authorities will compete to have a seat in such a place. These later imperiums in the 18th and 19th centuries can be understood by three important facts. The first being that the imperium is going to be conquered by the parliamentary forces, the second being that the parliamentary forces over time become more plebeian. The final one is that the democratic principle becomes the highest virtue, which gets generally accepted by all factions. The reason is because it'll allow them to gain power. The hunger for getting access to more power in the imperium, once again, for the desire to obtain power. Its roots is in the desire to obtain power. And the ideas of justifications, whether they be moral or not, come in terms of the process of thought secondly. And what comes first is the desire for power expansion. So the appeal to democratic ideals and all that is only nominal, and only done so because it's really backed by a motivation for power expansion. Despite the fact that the parliaments actually expand power and absolutism, it does take longer for this manifestation to be fully realized, as these assemblies are so huge all decisions take longer to come to. Moving on, he talks about the notion of totalitarian democracy, which to the contemporary mind seems like an oxymoron, but there's good reason to believe such a thing is real, and often than not more real than we would think. Through mass democratization, all powers which are at once in competition become less so when handed over to the people, and from here, this is why people don't notice the expansion of power, because it becomes very monolithic. Juvenal critiques the notion of sovereignty of the people as a fiction, because if power really lay within the people, it would follow that all could command each other, but this has never really been the case, or even can be the case if one even wants a civilization. It would be too unstable, essentially. He also points out that what makes a democracy totalitarian is that the general will triumphs, and all individual wills are crushed under the boot of the general collective will. Whereas in a monarchy, the will which is in power here is not the general or public will, but the particular and private will, which will only crush those who are in its way. And this is usually not the masses, but rather the middle powers, because they pose more of a threat. It is in the case of contemporary democracy that authority of the whole imposing its will on itself, as only the whole exists, according to this ideology. This idea comes from the ancient Greeks. However, Juvenal states that the Greek city-states were much closer to being an organic whole rather than an artificial one. The reason being is that these people, in this case, let's say the Greeks, came from the same ethnic background, share the same traditions and beliefs, etc. In modern society, it is a massive conglomeration of unrelated parts. So it is not even an organic whole, because nobody has ethnic ties to their soil in the same way our ancestors did. Another contradiction of democracy is the attack by large democracies on the smaller nations that set up their own governments. Truly, a nation with its own government has the right to rule itself in the way that people want. However, the large democratic powers ignore this, since the principle of power is to expand regardless of ideology. One must also know that this contradiction is of greater severity, because it makes more sense that a nation which is smaller is more likely to have a tight-knit community, therefore more organic government, as the large empires exist through a process of destroying and synthesizing different groups. Now, the democratic states are also more totalitarian because they now have access to wealth and resources that the kings did not have in the past. And like we mentioned earlier, they also have the ability to expand conscription into the military, since the warrior class has been subjugated. Now, what he calls the general interest being considered is the only interest, which is the general interest can be considered the public interest. Now, this does not allow for particular interest, and this creates a social animosity toward any particular interest or private interest. The more advanced a society gets, the more the interests become one. As when we contrast this with the Middle Ages, we had interest of farmers, royalty, warriors, etc. This was an accepted fact, but now it's no longer the case. So within a society, it is natural that different factions of power separate and are often opposed to the power which proclaims to serve the general interest. And because that power wishes to expand, the fractional powers tend to take precautionary measures to fight the higher power. Also, it should be mentioned once again that because society sees the general interest as the only valuable and legitimate one, it tends to socially ostracize particular interest. Now, so this is interesting. What I just want to kind of tie this in. What makes democracy more totalitarian is the fact that it takes the general interest or the interest of the collective will and stamps out all other wills. So there's no division of powers. There's only one monolithic power that exists, which is by nature authoritarian, by definition. Or actually, no, I'm sorry, by definition totalitarian. So that's the point he's trying to get at here. And you didn't have this in the Middle Ages because you had private powers, but there were multiple private powers which would basically make the society less totalitarian because there were multiple competing interests. But continuing on here, power can't be stopped, however, it can be hijacked by other interests or influences. In a monarchy, if the king is to be influenced, it can only occur through someone in his inner circle, perhaps someone that advises him. In the case of an aristocratic regime, if you wanted to influence a family, you would need to be involved with the family or social gatherings around the aristocrats. Now, finally, in a democracy, if you want to hijack this power, the factions can organize themselves in a way to try and move the public opinion in their favor against the current regime. A distinction between the range of power and the intensity of it should also be made. The amount of people you have dominion over is not the same as the intensity of power. For example, let's look at a king who has power over his subjects in a small kingdom, and this small kingdom must submit to his will, let's say. The kingdom is smaller, but the power holds a higher degree of intensity than an emperor who has dominion over large swaths of land, uh, as opposed to an emperor who has dominion over large swaths of land. But the people don't really listen to him, and they just kind of accept him as there. So it's important not to conflate intensity with the quantity of dominion. So touching back once again on a democracy, power is something that is constantly being competed for, and only certain private sectional interests can get the hold of it, which is the great irony. As this system purports to promote the general will, it instead ends up creating more factions than ever. When these factions get in, they tend to focus on what they want to get done alone and exclude the representation of all other interests, especially if those, like children who have no right to vote, for example, and thus have little attention is being paid to them because they have no voice. That's an example that Juvenal uses. The quote-unquote political machine is a very useful tool for warfare in a democratic system. These parties become basically recreational social groups combined with politics. The reason for making them more recreational or fun is that they want people of the party to have their trust, and the best way of doing that is to make the party more about than just ideology, and make it also about being like an extended family or a group of comrades. They also give members rewards to create a better incentive to stay, and these may be financial, for example, or just social. So as the political machine tightens its grip, so to speak, it becomes more strict and disciplined, and the members of the parties are encouraged not to engage with the enemy in any civil manner, and political discourse is also not encouraged. The only thing that matters is winning when we have reached this point. When the party takes over government, its power obviously increases, and when they permeate the parliaments, they make the barrier to entry very hard to surpass. We see this in America with the two-party system. It can happen with the one party as well. The president can change laws, etc., as long as he keeps his majority, but it's very easy to keep the majority when you control the flow of information and the entry into political competition. Because your party permeates all the powerful institutions, you essentially make yourself indispensable. And we can see this in America with, we see the same politicians over and over again, um, basically running for office and winning, right? It's very, we don't see a lot of non-politicians enter the political landscape. I mean, maybe Trump sure is an exception, but in general terms. So, despite the fact that typically or over time the imperium comes to be ruled by one government when a law is passed by the person in power, this can either make members of the party happy or upset when factions form. And then we get a state within the state, and now we start seeing these factions putting a check on each other. Uh, Many offer checks on power in the European states. However, these states have been unified for centuries and have a habit of operating in one way. So it would be a large and difficult task to do such a thing. Instead, they could be uh, limited internally rather than limited externally. So Juvenal calls these things make-weights. In modern politics, these will be things like worker syndicates. Make-weights are essentially smaller powers that the higher power wishes to dissolve. The make-weight powers, which want to restrict the growth of the state, actually end up aiding it because the state, being paranoid of it, seeks to crush them out and expand its power. So, since the genesis of the law has its resting place within the state now, and the state alone, as opposed to being considered something outside the state, like God or the church, etc., since it is the case that the state creates the law, the power becomes monolithic. In the state within the state, we see a complete permeation of one interest and the destruction of social formations. And then the law becomes self-referenced, and then power can change the law and thus justify its own expansion. So that's interesting. So, just to recap on that, since it is the case that the state creates the law, the power becomes monolithic because there's nothing outside of the state that justifies this law. And then within the state, we see a complete permeation of one interest and the destruction of social formations once this occurs. So it becomes even more monolithic and centralized. The division of power internally is not a solution to this, as this power is divided, but is still one unified power acting as one. And sure, there are conflicts of interest because of the bodies. However, the bodies all share in common that they want the unified power to survive. So these conflicts lack potency really and have no serious effect, is what the Juvenal is saying. The only way for power to be derailed would have to be by a power outside it that has the desire to do so and the ability to do so, because it has a complete different interest and fidelity to a different power structure. That's the problem. The loyalty and fidelity to a certain power structure is what maintains the fact that it's one monolithic power, and it's not really a limitation on it. Even if the interests are different, they still share the overall interest in maintaining that power structure. So it's not really that potent. Power which derives its sovereignty from the masses is better equipped to fight with other powers because this power is more potent as it uses the masses as a justification for expansion and can in a way totalize everything. Over time, it gets rid of other particular interests of society by crushing them in the name of the people, and often it often has the people on their side as they claim to speak for them. Kings, however, can't do this as they already isolate themselves from the masses as being their own interests, and other social interests exist as well. The middle powers, for instance, rather. In terms of law, if we want a state which is restricted, it would be preferable to have the law predate the existence of the state and the state beholden to its standard, because like we saw previously, when the state makes laws out of thin air, morality becomes conflated with the will of the state, and this becomes a totalized incarnation of power. So the issue is that the political authority makes the laws when it becomes self-justified, essentially, is the problem here. Laws, according to de Juvenal, should not be understood, then applied through the state. Let me repeat that. Laws, according to de Juvenal, should be understood first, then applied through the state, not created, then applied through the state. Not created by the state, then applied through the state. The only solution to this would have to be, once again, some kind of well-thought-out objective moral system. Social cohesion seems to be more important than law, as it is the basis for laws in the first place, and laws can't seem to work without the feeling of unity and common notions of value. Once this deteriorates, it happens that power comes in to intervene, and it must do so to secure the existence of the society. Some will try and say that power can be restricted by having all laws conform to one principle law in order to make sure that they don't overstep its boundaries. Now, you can have one principle law like the Constitution, for instance, but the problem is power will always find a way around this by saying that they're, have following this principle of law, that their interpretation of it is right, so it's okay to surpass it because the other interpretation is incorrect. We see this all the time in America with the Constitution, especially things like the Second Amendment or freedom of speech. Those are always, being reinterpreted by political parties. Law over time, when it sinks into state, becomes more chaotic and constantly changing. And this change is obviously used to justify power expansion once again. He also points out how the Greek and Roman societies valued by Enlightenment philosophers who value freedom don't realize that these societies were not free in the sense that they mean. Also, the genesis of liberty came in when the plebeian classes had more rights, and this became an issue because they started to pursue their own private interest, which led to the collapse of social cohesion and even had effects on the agrarian economy. The issue de Juvenal states with a libertarian regime is that no society can function because, yes, people may hold interests in common, but their differing interests will collide with the common and often override, leading to instability. This is how states come into being because the deprivation of a social order creates the conditions for the masses to desire a leader, and this desire will erect a leader and state for them. Despite the fact that people value liberty, they don't realize that the monarchies, or along with the aristocracy, were more free because the aristocratic powers always were trying to prevent the monarchic ones um, from power expansion. So the focus was between those two domains. Mostly, nobody cared too much what the peasants did. It was, you know, the middle and high powers were concerned with each other more than anything. Monarchy strengthens the attempts for authority and aristocracy for liberty. So, monarchy. Let me repeat that. Monarchy is basically strengthens the pursuit of attempting to centralize an aristocracy for liberty because the aristocrats want to be free from the monarch. The aristocrats can try and use this fact that the monarchy is trying to expand power by basically promoting Caesar-like figures to give the peasantry what they like. We can understand this as Caesarism, and this Caesarism values three things. The first, that the old elites who have power and liberty should lose it. And second, that a new class of elites should rise, typically capitalist ones with vast wealth. And finally, that there needs to be a synthesis between political strength and social weakness. I assume to take advantage of the socially weak is why that's being promoted. The Juvenal starts to talk about the price of liberty. And he says the price of liberty, or the desire of liberty, fluctuates. This can be compared to the value someone may have in regards to water or gold. They will value gold so long as the basic needs of having things like water to drink are met. And yes, gold costs more than water, but when a human is parched or dying of thirst, he will value water more than gold. So using that analogy, we can understand that the relationship between liberty and authority to the human subject. Liberty can be viewed in the same way. When there is an excess of authority, one tends to value liberty more because it is what they are lacking. But once they get liberty, and there is thus an excess of liberty leading to social instability, they value authority. Despite this, security is always a more primary need in individuals as they value their safety over liberty. We can see this today with people pushing for things like gun control, for instance. They'd rather sacrifice the ability to own a firearm in order that they can feel safer and more secure. Fear is a motivating factor in all human decisions, so they tend to emphasize it because of the fear of death at any moment, and that is why security is primary to liberty as a human value, psychologically speaking. Once again, when security is felt too strongly, the will to liberty increases, and vice versa. De Juvenal used this example how in kingdoms the inhabitants would value security because they didn't want to be killed by other clans. However, eventually when they felt secure enough, they venture out, and the same with intellectuals taking refuge in the church, which protected them. And then once they felt safe, they left the church because previously they were killed by barbarians and the churches provided a safe space. In regards to desiring security and liberty, those in power wish to maintain security, which for them is also their liberty. And those at the bottom wish to extend liberty as well. Speaking once again on authority, the king will use social promotion to help expand his power. He'll use the resentment of certain classes as a means to employ them as a tool against the aristocrats who threaten the king's power. They then can create a new aristocratic class which got its power from the top down. Once the old aristocratic class starts to decay, they tend themselves to become more securitarian because they want to basically secure their existence. The middle class or aristocratic classes are the classes which discipline the lowest class, and do in some sense provide a lot of stability. But this class has its own power, but it's not powerful enough to use their liberties as they like. So they don't need protection, but they can't overstep their boundaries because they're a smaller power, is essentially what is being said. Now, this class can only come into existence when society has a certain level of security, that it can have two powerful classes in it, high and middle. Before then, it is typically one homogeneous class or union/aggregate of classes working together to create a general stability out of instability. But once that stability is reached, they can then basically part ways because they can afford to do it. The middle class wants nothing more than to be free from external pressures. It wants liberty. Once it has its liberty, it will either provide the people with security and retain the liberty for themselves, or give the people liberty as well. And we see this, de Juvenal says, with the 18th and 19th century liberalism. The classes which use the most self-discipline are the employing classes, as they tend to prevent abuses and allocate resources better. The classes that tend to care only about the security of its possessions are the capitalist class. The capitalist class seems to essentially be a decaying aristocracy that lost its will to discipline. The masses would rather maintain its dominion over itself and its possessions. Something else that is important to note is that in times of security, men tend to pursue their own interests instead of working for the state, as the security allows them to secure the space and do so as they please. However, in times of insecurity, we often see the average people, or people we would not normally expect, they try and take power in the state. Because people tend to value security more than liberty, as we established before, they tend to trend toward what Juvenal calls the quote-unquote social protectorate, which is essentially, from my understanding, social laws which help maintain security. I think this can be used through the state, but is also independent of it. Despite the fact that mankind has become overall less religious, we see that the state still absorbs and retains elements of faith and a religious fervor in its actions. Juvenal states that once again power passes into the hands of a winning sect, and it becomes theocratic, and its values are often instilled into this society ad nauseum. There's a disillusion of private life, and people speak less of their right to private life, and rather they seize power to enact their way of life so they can be able to protect it. So this kind of goes back to the previous point that in the democratic societies there seems to be a scramble of different factions to infiltrate the parliament and dilute it with their own gang interests, essentially. Going back to this idea of the social protectorate, we see that this expands. The state does as well, and we get a maternal state rather than a patriarchal state, which seeks to essentially take care of us as if we were helpless infants. This state doesn't wish to shape us into strong individuals in a community. Rather, it seeks to make us helpless and weak and dependent upon the state for more than just protection, but for all things. You can think of it almost like a Freudian overbearing mother, in a sense. Power also in this state becomes arbitrary in its actions. It also has to make so many decisions because it has taken this maternal role that it no longer really has time to reflect on the outcomes of these decisions. Therefore, despotism arises as little care is given to outcomes, and power becomes unstable because of this. Naturally, this once again opens us back to wanting an authority, in particular absolute power, to step in for the chaos we are surrounded by. The Juvenal moves on by saying that all of human society relies on confidence and trust that all members perform their functions properly, and that any disturbance of one member of society affects the rest of society, no matter how minuscule. He also goes on to say that because of all this, our ideas and actions are informed by those who come before us, and they set up our ways in some sense, and and in the way in which we think in society. He also talks about how in societies the media is used as a tool to help create this false image of reality in people's heads, and this is not done through appealing to logic, but rather to emotion. As the state is centralized and societies get more advanced, this becomes more centralized. The reason this occurs with journalists is because there is no social ethic or code binding their behavior, or the ones that do are very weak. It's a lack of spiritual and social authority that leads to a despotic media producing a false sense of security. The consequences of a lack of spiritual authority are also things like materialistic science, and this has influenced the state in return as well. He goes on to state that this breeds societal chaos and instability, and because of this lack of spiritual unification and security, the only path forward is to enact strict repression or to reorganize society from chaos back to order. Juvenal makes the final point here that we can't critique totalitarian regimes without critiquing that which allowed them to exist in the first place. We can't say that the overemphasis of an order and power is bad without saying that the overemphasis on chaos and disorder is bad, as that is what leads to it, the overemphasis of order and power in the first place. So the overemphasis rather, on chaos and liberty leads to destabilization and insecurity. Insecurity leads to totalitarianism. And with that, that is basically all there is. That's the conclusion here of my notes. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, definitely go read that book. I didn't cover everything. He uses a lot of historical examples. He talks about the Middle Ages, which, they're great examples, and it's good when you have someone who takes theory and applies it to history, because that really confirms the validity of the theory. So definitely read that book. Definitely worth the watch, worth the read. But that's it.